Schalock, I'm wondering if you can give us an overview of your quality of life framework, and in particular, tell us a little bit about the domains and the factors.
Back in the 80s, where we were going through the civil rights movement, going through issues like deinstitutionalization and mainstream and normalization, these were very powerful principles in terms of changing policies and practices towards people with developmental disabilities throughout the world, really. But they lacked something, and what they lacked was a personal reference. Because, you know, as we talked about deinstitutionalization, we were talking about bringing people into the community. When we were talking about normalization, we were talking about how can we normalize environments for people. When we talked about inclusion, we were talking about, you know, how can we include people with disabilities into the mainstream of life. But what was missing in those three major movements, which had tremendous impacts on the current service delivery system, the missing piece of that was what happens to people in the process. We really had no idea as to how to conceptualize or how to measure what really is the benefit to people from these major movements. So as a result of that, the field began to think about, is there an overlying construct or concept that we could use to really look at what's the impact of what we do on people's lives. And what emerged was this concept of quality of life. Historically, the concept of quality of life really came out of medicine and physical well-being. But yet the concept, the notion of a life of quality really was very appealing to everyone. It became a very quick, sensitizing notion. Quickly it became a common language that we could use across heterogeneous groups, stakeholders as they're usually referred to. And so the net result was a number of us then began to think about what is quality of life, how do you conceptualize it, how do you give it meaning, how do you measure it, and ultimately how do you apply what you learn about people's quality of life. Over a series of years of work, of research, much of it multicultural across different language groups, what has emerged is the current, what we call conceptual measurement framework. That framework, in the simplest sense, says that quality of life is a multidimensional phenomenon. We can talk about quality of life factors, which are kind of the overarching areas of quality of life. And those factors are really very easy to communicate to people because they basically involve independence, they involve social participation, and they involve well-being. We can then talk about what we call quality of life domains. And these domains we've done a lot of research on cross-culturally. These domains have what we call etic properties, which means that they have universal meaning regardless of where you are. And those 8 domains that have emerged from a number of studies are the domains of personal development, for example. And personal development is essentially learning skills, becoming more competent, doing the kinds of things that all of us have done as we've grown and matured and become more competent and complex. Self-determination is a very powerful domain. It's really the domain that the self-advocate movement is based on in many respects. And what it means essentially is, do people have the opportunity to make choices and decisions about what happens in their life? Interpersonal relations is a third domain. That domain is, as the name implies, it's do we have friends, do we have associates, do we have a network of individuals that we can turn to for not just social sustenance and enjoyment, but support. And that's where the natural support network comes into play. We have social inclusion, which is really the intent of mainstreaming, and that whole movement, deinstitutionalization, was to include people in the mainstream of life. And the 5th dimension is rights. That's an interesting dimension because usually when we think about that part of our life, we think about legal rights that people have. And certainly if you look at the history of developmental disabilities, you know, much of the legislation has dealt with the legal rights that people are entitled to. The right to education, the right to community access, the right to free speech, etc. But as we really looked at rights from the perspective of self-advocates and families, it became very apparent that there's another aspect to rights. We call this the human rights, the civil rights. And those are the rights that are really the most important in many respects to people with disabilities as we talk with them. And those Human rights are the right to have dignity, to be treated with dignity, to be treated with respect, and to have the right of privacy. So as you then move into the next domain, we get into emotional well-being, and then the importance of emotional well-being is it relates to how safe do we feel, how secure do we feel, are we satisfied with life, are we happy, are we contented, and that's such an important part of our life. In fact, a lot of programs historically have used satisfaction as a major indicator of the services. And I think one of the significant changes that has occurred because of the quality of life movement is to realize that satisfaction's the best way to deal with satisfaction is as an indicator of emotional well-being as opposed to an indicator of program effects. The other domains are in the well-being area. We have physical well-being, which is the obvious historical, they reach back to physical health. And then finally we have material well-being, which deals not just with employment and with vocational activities, but deals with possessions and ownership and all that. So part of the model then is really this framework of thinking about quality of life as composed of these three factors, but then within those factors you have those 8 domains. The last part of the conceptual model is really the measurement model. And then for each of those domains, which have universal properties, then we work at the local level by developing what we call indicators of each of those domains. And so for example, in terms of emotional well-being, an indicator would be contentment or satisfaction or happiness. With material well-being is, do you have possessions? Can you own things? Do you have a job? With physical well-being, how is your health? How is your nutrition? So the domains then have indicators that are developed at the local level, and then these indicators are what are used as the basis for the measurement of one's quality. We've demonstrated in our cross-cultural studies that the domains have etic properties or universal properties, and we realize that the indicators have emic properties, which means that they are really cultural based. So as we work with agencies such as Community Living British Columbia in developing assessment tools like they developed in Edmonton, and we'll be using the Edmonton's tool. We work with local focus groups to make sure that those indicators are reflective of what is important to people who live in that area. And that's kind of interesting, Henry, because as you look at, I've done that sort of focus group work in a number of countries, and the indicators are slightly different across cultures, but they're not that. But the other thing that's really interesting about those indicators is that those indicators generally can be used across diagnostic groups. And this is something that the viewers might be interested in, because a lot of people have assumed historically a number of things that we, I think, demonstrate to be inaccurate or incorrect. One assumption was that you had to have a separate instrument for each level of intellectual disability or each type of developmental disability. And we've shown that really is a faulty assumption. The other faulty assumption is that what's characteristic for people with a diagnosis of autism or intellectual disability or developmental disability or mental health or mental illness or dual diagnosis, I mean, these diagnoses go on forever, that you have to have separate indicators for each of these groups. And we've demonstrated in a very large project in Spain and Catalonia that simply isn't an incorrect assumption. So what we're doing now is demonstrating that even for people of age, those indicators hold up across. The thing that makes, I think, the quality of life concept so powerful is it's a universal language. And consequently, you don't have to explain, when I speak to self-advocates, or when I speak to parents, or when I speak to anyone, I don't have to explain what quality of life is really all about. I simply ask people. In yesterday's session with the self-advocates, for example, I started by saying, let's think about your quality of life and tell me what is important to you. And it was amazing. In the period of 15 minutes from those self-advocates, they identified the 8 domains. I didn't have to tell them what those domains were. They knew what those domains are.
That's right.
And I think that's really the power of the